Is this working? Can everyone hear me? Great. I'm Kourtney Bitterly. I'm research lead from the New York Times. And so we view our mission as helping people understand the world. And more recently, we've been doing that. We've been expanding our offer through audio, launching things like The Daily, Caliphate, still processing, which is really great. Thank you. I also really appreciate Jenna and Wesley. But we've really, as we expanded those offerings and really have seen success in those, what we realized is we were seeing, as Debbie quoted earlier, that we're seeing so many of these smart speakers take off. So what does that really mean? Is voice the same as audio? How should we be thinking about this space? And I think we've uncovered a lot of really interesting things because, in our newsroom, we're really used to creating content, but with these smart speakers, we're essentially having to create entire user experiences as well. And so the way that we approach this is we decided to do some design research. So we set out across the country. We went to 3 markets, Seattle, Miami, and Detroit, and we spoke to over 20 people in their homes because we really wanted to observe them. Since even though a lot of people are buying, oh, whoops. Okay, I'm ruining this a little bit, but that's okay. But yeah, so we set out across the country to really learn from these different markets. And we interviewed over 20 people. And the reason we chose this approach is that we really wanted to be able, since this is such a nascent space, to really spend time and understand people's behaviors. Because it's not quite yet, even though we're seeing a bunch of articles about what people are doing, what they're buying, we're not necessarily understanding why they're doing it. So a couple of the things that we did is we actually, maybe I should just, sorry that I'm ruining. Okay, there we go. So a couple of the things that we did is we actually went out and we had these provocations. So we called them sacrificial concepts. And essentially what they were, because this is a very nascent space still to this day, we wanted to start to understand what are some of the boundaries that people are creating for themselves. So we did things that we were trying to help understand. Oh, we're going to.
You're okay.
Okay. I was like, we're just trying to, induce, unfortunately, some agita in everyone with this presentation shaking a lot. But what we did is we went out with some of these sacrificial concepts. And so because we're trying to understand, a lot of the uses that people have for these devices right now are still very basic. They're setting alarms. They're asking for the weather. So we wanted to understand what would they be potentially open to in the future. So we did things like the center one, which was my favorite, is that if you asked for the news and you sounded sad, is that the device would acknowledge that you were sad and would say, you sound sad. Do you want to pick me up? Everyone universally found that creepy. 100% of the people that we interviewed were like, absolutely not. We do not want Alexa telling us we sound sad. That would make us need additional therapy on top of the therapy we're already getting. And so what we realized, though, is people are trying to create boundaries. And that's what we really wanted to understand. So what we learned is that right now, people are experiencing these devices in these 3 different modes. So there's ambient, and this is where people are really just using it as a radio. They're playing the news, they're playing it they're playing podcasts, they're playing music. Assistive, this is where they're viewing it more as a service, and this happens in multitasking moments. So things like even flash briefings actually were falling into this category. But things like setting in alarms, it's really helping people as they're going about their routines. And then captive, captive was where people were viewing it as a destination. Where these things are right now is that it kind of feels like a lot of quizzes fall into this space. And that kids actually tend to be the users that have the biggest patience to really view this as a destination. And we also saw, since this disappeared, maybe I will move. Okay, great. But what we saw, again, is that there's a lot of tensions that exist as people are still creating these boundaries. So the first one was adoption versus intrusion. So, even though people are buying these devices really rapidly, they're still expressing caution about privacy. Futuristic versus nostalgic. So we heard a lot of people mentioning things like the movie Her or Minority Report when they talked about buying these devices, but at the same time, they were mainly using it as a radio. And then communal versus individual. It's inherently shared, but you can use it to support some of your individual routines. And then functional versus novelty. I won't touch on every single one, but functional versus novelty is that we found that things were really kind of breaking into these like two categories, that they were either super tactical, like Alexa, turn out the lights, or it was very novelty, like playing 20 questions. And so the insights that we gathered from this is that as much as people were buying these devices, mainly because, not necessarily because of the big part of why they were buying these is that they were really starting to like reevaluate the relationship that they had with technology and screens in particular, and that smart speakers were becoming a place where they could mediate that. And so even though it wasn't necessarily the impetus for buying them, a lot of times the impetus was because they got a free like gift with purchase when they bought something from Amazon or even Google, is that as they started using them, they really felt like there was this benefit that they started getting off of their phones more. And so I think for us, what we saw is, so many people talked about rabbit holes. They're like, I go to check one thing on my phone, and then like 30 minutes later, I'm on Instagram, and I don't even understand how that happened. And so, we thought that kind of the smart home. Oh, my trying to avoid all of this isn't really going so well. I'm R&D lead, so you would think that I was a little bit more like tech savvy. It's not really showing up very well. But yeah, I think that the other aspect of this is, we've always assumed that the future of the smart home was about constant connection, but we saw people feeling addicted and overwhelmed by their devices, and that the thing that they were really looking for is to kind of take control, take power back. They felt like things were constantly being pushed at them, so the ability to actually pull something felt really powerful. And then how we saw people kind of expressing their relationship to news through this was the fact that right now native content is pretty limited on these devices, which I actually see as an opportunity for all of us in the room to really speak to one another, understand what we're learning, and really kind of define what some of these things, what these kind of content types will look like. And so what we found, though, is that this was kind of the complement to some of the content. Is that, it's great. Like an R&D leads talk that's like plagued by technical challenges, it's always a really good sign. But what we saw is that, this was the complement of the addictive nature of technology, is that these constant refresh mechanisms, content was filling them, whether it was from social channels or whether it was from news organizations themselves. And so people were really looking for an escape as well. And they were talking about the fact that news fatigue feels very real. My favorite is that Enterprise Rent-A-Car did a survey about people's travel plans and the reasons that they were traveling. And the top 3 reasons were stress, the news, and the political climate. And so the fact that this was trickling down into renting a car means that we really need to start to think about what's the tone and cadence of the news. We heard a lot of people just talk about the fact that they felt like they needed to make a choice between staying informed and staying mentally healthy. But the bright spot of all of that was audio, is that as they talked about the fact that they were so tired of looking at their phones, they were so tired of all of these push notifications about breaking news, as one woman in Miami told us, like, the fact that Trump yelled at a reporter doesn't feel like something I need to know exactly at 1:23 p.m. It feels like I could get caught up on that later. I don't know why someone's pushing a notification to my phone about that. But what we saw with audio is that audio actually felt like a break. It really kind of felt like it wasn't constrained by that same relationship that people had with the news. And so the reason that they said is, it's stuff that I think everyone on this panel knows, is that it just feels like smart people having a conversation. And so it allowed people to really access complicated subject matter in a different way. We talked to an art student who was actually listening to a podcast on gravitational waves. And she's like, if I were to read this, there's no way I could understand it. But because I'm hearing a smart, passionate person talk about it, I actually remember it, and then I go and I talk about it with my friends. And these are some of, the stats that I think have already been shared about how much we're seeing podcast listenership grow. But I think with these devices, what we're starting to see is that maybe the formats need to change. So maybe we need to start experimenting. The daily is 20 plus minutes. A lot of people were talking about, the moments that I'm using these devices the most are at like 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. when I'm getting ready in the morning, when I'm getting out the door. So we need to start thinking about how can we actually adjust what we're doing to meet people where they are. And so some of the considerations that we have been reflecting on with how we can design for these voice environments is, number one, acknowledging shared consumption. As a print and digital publisher, I think what's interesting is that the most natural thing that people do with our content is have a conversation about it, but we don't always design for it. We design for very individual consumption. Embedding in existing routines. So I think, as I said before, we're really creating user experiences when we do this. We're not just creating content, so we need to be a little bit more aware of that. Sparking discovery. So in these environments, discovery is really, really hard. It's really hard. People have to know what to say. They have to then remember to say it frequently. And so it's a really big challenge. So we need to start to extend those reminders off the platform. And then lastly, matching the voice to the moment. So something else that we saw is that, people started to get fatigued with the digital assistant, with the voice assistant voices. And so we saw that when it came to telling a story, they still really wanted a person to tell them that. They wanted a human being to tell them that. It was fine if an assistant could actually help them with tasks, but people still really want to have human beings tell them stories. So as a result, these are a couple of the things that we built, which I won't go into too much detail because I know we're going over time. But we relaunched the Daily. We relaunched the Pop Music Roundup on Alexa. The Times Book Review is something else that we launched as kind of helping people get inspired about what they can read. We created a flash briefing that's hosted by Michael Barbaro. And then we created a Times News quiz. And all of this is not to say that we think these are the answers, but these are things that we think are experiments that we really want to learn from. So thank you so much.